few days ago, I published a video with a very simple argument. I said Zach Cregger's Resident Evil might succeed for one reason. Not because it had zombies, not because it looked faithful, not because it borrowed locations from the games, but because Cregger seemed to understand something previous Resident Evil movies often didn't. The games are not really about monsters, they're about pressure. 20 hours later, Sony released the first full trailer, which means we can finally stop speculating because now we have evidence. And after watching this trailer several times, I think it passed the first and perhaps the biggest test. This is DarkSpotting. Last time, I argued that adapting Resident Evil was never primarily about copying Leon, Claire, or the Spencer Mansion. It was about translating a very specific psychological experience into cinema. The experience of being completely underqualified inside a catastrophe that keeps getting worse. Now a trailer cannot tell us whether a movie will be good. Trailers lie all the time. They hide weak dialogue, they manufacture pacing, they spoil twists while concealing structural problems. A great trailer can advertise a terrible film, and a mediocre trailer can undersell a masterpiece. So this isn't a review, it's a stress test. Does this trailer demonstrate that Zach Cregger actually understands the grammar of Resident Evil? Or was my optimism misplaced? Because there is a difference between recognizing Resident Evil and understanding why it works. Let's find out. Before we talk about monsters, before we talk about Easter eggs, before we freeze frames looking for references, I want to start somewhere much more fundamental. Who are we following? Because horror is never just about what hunts you, it's about who gets hunted. That sounds obvious, but it changes everything. Imagine exactly the same outbreak, exactly the same city, exactly the same creatures. Now change only one variable. Instead of following an ordinary person, we follow someone who has spent 15 years clearing bioweapon outbreaks. The entire emotional equation changes. Fear doesn't disappear, but its shape does. You stop wondering, can this person survive? And start wondering, how cool will this fight be? Resident Evil can become entertaining that way. It can even become spectacular, but survival horror begins to evaporate because competence is comforting, preparedness is comforting, experience is comforting. The moment someone understands the nightmare becomes smaller. That is why Brian matters. Not because he replaces Leon, not because he introduces some revolutionary new storyline, because he restores asymmetry. He is walking into a disaster that understands him far better than he understands it. Think about his job. He's a medical courier. His day is supposed to consist of deliveries, schedules, routes, hospitals, traffic. Instead, he walks into one of the most catastrophic biological failures in modern fiction. And for several minutes, the trailer never lets us forget that. Look at the way he moves. Look at how often he hesitates, how frequently he seems unsure of what he's even looking at. There is panic, but not movie panic, not the kind where characters scream for 3 seconds before turning into superheroes. This is uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty every Resident Evil player remembers. What exactly is happening? Can I go that way? Should I even open that door? That feeling, more than any zombie, is what I was looking for. Then something happened while I was reading reactions online. A comment kept appearing in different forms, different people, different communities, but essentially the same sentence. This actually feels like Resident Evil. Not this looks like Resident Evil. Feels. That distinction is important because previous adaptations usually looked right. Umbrella logos, liquors, the mansion, the police station, familiar names, recognizable monsters. Recognition isn't difficult, understanding is. Anyone can recreate the furniture. Very few filmmakers recreate the anxiety. And anxiety is what survival horror really sells. Resident Evil has never been a power fantasy disguised as horror. It's almost the opposite. It systematically strips power away from you. Information, resources, confidence, control, one by one, until every decision starts carrying weight. That's why I became interested in Cregger months ago, not because he promised faithfulness, because he kept describing situations, movement, scarcity, ordinary people, changing environments, not lore, experience, that suggested he wasn't adapting events, he was adapting conditions. And after seeing this full trailer, I think that distinction wasn't accidental. But there is one moment in the trailer that convinced me more than anything else. Ironically, it isn't a monster, it isn't an explosion, it isn't even one of the big set pieces Sony clearly wants people talking about. It's a tiny moment, one that lasts only a few seconds, yet I think it reveals exactly how Cregger thinks about Resident Evil, because it isn't really about shooting, it's about wasting, and that may be the single most Resident Evil thing in the entire trailer. The moment I was talking about happens very quickly. Brian fires, nothing happens, he has spent ammunition, and the problem is still there. If you've never played Resident Evil, it might seem like an ordinary action beat, but if you've spent years inside these games, your brain reacts differently because every shot has an invisible price tag attached to it. That is one of the hardest things to adapt. Not zombies, not monsters, not gore, scarcity. The games don't simply ask, can you kill this enemy? They ask something much more uncomfortable. Can you afford to? That is a completely different kind of tension. I started thinking about Resident Evil in a different way over the last few days. Not simply as survival horror, but as economic horror. Not economic in the financial sense, economic in the sense that everything has to be budgeted. Bullets, medicine, time, energy, risk and knowledge. Every encounter becomes an accounting problem. You aren't trying to become powerful, you're trying not to become bankrupt. Bankrupt of ammunitions, bankrupt of options, bankrupt of hope. And if Cregger understands that, he understands something many adaptations have completely missed, because action movies make you feel stronger every time the protagonist picks up a weapon. Resident Evil should make you feel temporarily less doomed. Those are not the same emotion. Think about your favorite Resident Evil memories. They're probably not the biggest explosions, they're the tiny decisions. Should I use the green herb now or save it? Should I fight or run? Should I explore that hallway or pretend I never saw it? Should I unlock this door or go back? The games transform logistics into suspense, and that's incredibly rare. Most horror movies generate tension through uncertainty. Resident Evil often generates tension through arithmetic. You know exactly how many bullets you have, exactly how injured you are, exactly how many healing items remain. The uncertainty isn't mathematical, it's biological. Will reality demand more than you possess? That is terrifying. The trailer can't literally hand us an inventory screen. It shouldn't. Cinema has different tools, but it can make every resource feel fragile. It can make every mistake feel irreversible. It can make every success feel expensive. Watching Brian stumble through the trailer, I never had the impression that he was accumulating power. I had the impression that he was borrowing survival, minute by minute, room by room, and that is a very Resident Evil emotion. There's another reason I was optimistic before this trailer ever existed, and strangely, it has nothing to do with Resident Evil. It has to do with Zach Cregger. Go back and think about Barbarian. What makes that movie memorable isn't simply the creature, it's the building. The house lies. Every time you think you've understood its structure, another layer appears underneath. One hidden corridor, then another, until the architecture itself becomes the monster. That isn't just clever filmmaking, it's a storytelling obsession. Cregger doesn't merely use locations. He uses locations that betray the people inside them. Resident Evil has always worked the same way. Think about the places that define the franchise. The Spencer Mansion, the Raccoon City Police Department, the hospital, the laboratories, the sewers. None of them are simply settings. They're masks. Each one presents itself as something ordinary before revealing an uglier truth beneath that surface. A mansion becomes a laboratory, a police station becomes a trap, a hospital becomes a factory of infection, a city becomes an experiment. Resident Evil has always suggested that civilization itself is built on hidden rooms, literally and morally. That's one reason the trailer interested me. Notice how often Brian isn't simply fighting. He's moving, crossing, descending, searching, passing through one environment into another. The locations don't feel decorative. They feel sequential, almost like chapters. Each new space teaches him a different rule. A tunnel behaves differently from a hospital. A snowy roadside behaves differently from an industrial facility. The environment itself becomes an adversary. That's exactly how the games work. Not because every area contains a boss, because every area forces you to think differently. One of my favorite details is how little the trailer rushes to explain everything. It trusts confusion. That's an underrated quality in horror. Modern blockbusters are terrified you'll misunderstand something, so they explain and explain and explain again. Resident Evil has always been much more comfortable allowing you to feel temporarily lost. The architecture tells the story before the exposition does. You notice strange doors, security systems, medical equipment, research facilities, blood where blood shouldn't be. You begin assembling the catastrophe yourself. The horror doesn't arrive fully formed. It accumulates. That's far more immersive because discovery belongs to the audience. This is where I think Cregger may have a genuine advantage over previous directors. He doesn't appear interested in showing us the biggest monsters as quickly as possible. He seems interested in making us wonder what kind of place we've actually entered. And that's a much darker question, because monsters can be killed, places can remain diseased forever, but none of this guarantees success. In fact, there's still one concern I haven't been able to shake. Ironically, it's created by one of the trailer's greatest strengths, the momentum, because Resident Evil isn't simply frightening when things move. Sometimes it's frightening when they stop, and whether this film understands that may determine everything. So, does that mean I'm convinced? Not yet, because the trailer also raises one question I can't answer until I see the finished film. Can Resident Evil remain survival horror if it never slows down? That may sound like an odd criticism after I've spent 10 minutes praising the trailer, but think about how fear actually works. Fear isn't constant. It breeds. One of Resident Evil's oldest tricks isn't simply throwing monsters at you, it's making you walk through the silence afterward. You leave a fight, your heart is still racing. You finally think you're safe, then you hear a door creak, or footsteps, or nothing at all. Sometimes, nothing is worse, because your imagination immediately starts spending resources your body doesn't have. You become suspicious of every hallway, every corner, every unopened room. That psychological space is incredibly important. The trailer, by necessity, is almost relentless. New location, new creature, new chase, new explosion. That's understandable. Trailers are advertisements. They compress 2 hours into 2 minutes, but compression can accidentally create the impression that the movie is always sprinting. If that's true, I think something valuable could be lost, because survival horror isn't simply acceleration, it is oscillation. Pressure, release, pressure again. And not because the release is comforting, because it gives your imagination time to become your enemy. That's something I hope Cregger understands. And to be fair, his previous work suggests he probably does. Barbarian wasn't frightening because it never stopped. It was frightening because it knew exactly when to stop. There is another reason this trailer gives me hope, and it has nothing to do with zombies. Resident Evil has always been misunderstood in one important way. People often say it's about viral outbreaks, or monsters, or bioweapons. I don't think that's true. Those are the consequences, not the cause. The real monster has always been institutional arrogance. Umbrella doesn't simply create creatures, it creates conditions. Scientists who stop asking whether they should, executives who treat human beings as inventory, security systems designed to protect research instead of people, a corporation so insulated from ordinary life that an entire city becomes acceptable collateral. That's why Resident Evil has endured for almost 30 years, because beneath all the mutated flesh, there's a familiar nightmare, not supernatural evil, administrative evil. The apocalypse doesn't arrive because hell opens. It arrives because enough intelligent people convince themselves that nothing can go wrong, and that it does. That's why Brian interests me. He's not investigating Umbrella, he's living downstream from it. He's one of the countless people who had absolutely nothing to do with the decisions, but inherits all the consequences. And honestly, isn't that how institutional disasters usually work? The people making catastrophic decisions rarely become the first victims. The consequences travel. Workers, patients, families, commuters, delivery drivers, medical couriers, ordinary people. Resident Evil has always understood something profoundly profoundly unsettling. Catastrophe has a supply chain. The trailer seems to remember that, and I hope the movie never forgets it. So, did the trailer pass its biggest test? I think it did. Not because every shot looked perfect, not because every creature looked exactly like the games, and not because I suddenly believe this will be the greatest Resident Evil adaptation ever made. Because for the first time in a long time, I watched a Resident Evil trailer and I kept thinking about survival instead of spectacle. I wasn't counting explosions, I was counting bad options. That's a very important difference. The trailer doesn't merely suggest a city filled with monsters. It suggests a city that has become progressively impossible to move through. Every new environment looks like another negotiation, another compromise, another calculation. Keep going or die where you are. That's Resident Evil. A few days ago, I argued that adapting Resident Evil meant adapting pressure. Today, after seeing the trailer, I think that idea has survived its first real contact with evidence. Whether the finished movie earns that optimism, we will discover in September. But for the first time in years, I don't feel like Hollywood is trying to remake Resident Evil. I feel like someone can actually be trying to recreate the experience of surviving it. And those are two very different ambitions. What did you see in the trailer? Did it convince you that Zach Cregger understands Resident Evil? Or do you think this is still another movie wearing the franchise's skin? I genuinely like to know where you stand, because this is one of the most interesting horror adaptations currently in development. And if more interviews, new footage, or major revelations appear before release, we'll come back and test that theory again. Until then, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.